My wife texted me at 7:15 on our 10th wedding anniversary and said she was stuck at work, and I believed her, right up until the second I watched her lean across a candlelit table and kiss her boss on the mouth, and right up until a hand I didn't know closed around my wrist from behind and a voice I'd never heard said, "Don't move, not yet. You don't understand what you're looking at. I want you to sit with that for a second," because I did. Standing on a sidewalk in the cold, with my hand on a restaurant door, I never got to open, because that's the night my marriage split into a before and an after, and I didn't even get to choose how it happened. 10 years earlier I married Claire Bennett in her mother's backyard with 40 guests and a borrowed sound system. And I remember thinking, this is the easiest decision I will ever make in my life. And for a long time it was. We built something ordinary and good. The kind of good you don't notice until it's gone. A house in a decent neighborhood, a dog named Biscuit who ruined 2 couches, a running joke about who left the cabinet doors open. Claire worked her way up at a mid-sized property development firm, Voss Realty Group, starting as an assistant and clawing her way into an operations manager title, over 6 years of unpaid overtime and swallowed frustration, and I was proud of her in the specific way you're proud of someone who never asked for credit and never got enough of it. I sold industrial equipment for a living, decent money, nothing glamorous, and between the two of us we made it work, until the year everything underneath us quietly buckled. My father's construction company, the one he built with his hands starting when he was 26, started bleeding money the same year he was diagnosed with the kind of illness that eats through savings faster than it eats through a body. I didn't know how bad it was. I want to be honest about that, because it matters later. I thought Dad was managing. I thought Claire and I were managing. What I didn't know was that my wife had quietly become the only person standing between my father's business collapsing publicly and my father's business surviving another year, and I didn't know what that cost her. And I didn't know what she'd done to pay it. Not until a stranger's hand stopped me from doing something I could never take back. I want to back up even further, because you need to understand who Claire was before any of this, not the woman I caught through a restaurant window, but the 26-year-old who used to leave sticky notes in my lunch bag before either of us could afford a real vacation, who drove 4 hours in a snowstorm the year my father had his first heart scare just so I wouldn't sit in that hospital waiting room alone, who once worked a double shift at a coffee shop on top of her regular job for 3 straight months so we could cover a security deposit on our first apartment without asking either of our parents for help. That's the woman I married. That's the woman who sat next to my father's hospital bed reading him the sports section because his eyes were too tired to focus on the small print himself. I need you to hold on to that image, because it matters more than the one I'm about to describe. And because the whole tragedy of what happened to her only makes sense once you understand that the woman capable of a desperate decision under pressure was the exact same woman who would have done almost anything to keep my family from watching everything they'd built collapse in a hospital corridor. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because the unraveling didn't start with the anniversary, it started about 4 months before it. In small ways I explained away, because explaining things away is a full-time job when you love someone. Claire started taking calls in the garage. Not suspicious on its own, people take calls in garages, except she'd never done it before, not once in 9 years, and now she did it 3 or 4 times a week, door shut, voice low, and when I asked, she said it was a difficult client. A deal that kept falling apart. Richard writing her about numbers. Richard Voss. Her boss. The man who signed her paychecks and, I would later learn, signed a great deal more than that. She started working later. Not dramatically later, just enough. 45 minutes here. An hour there. Always with a reason. Always plausible. An audit. A walkthrough. A broker running behind schedule. I noticed she'd started deleting her text threads with him. Not all of them. Just enough that when I glanced at her phone charging on the counter, his name sat alone at the bottom of her recent messages with nothing above it. Which is the kind of thing you notice and then immediately talk yourself out of noticing. Because the alternative is a conversation you don't want to have. I remember one Tuesday in particular, maybe 5 months before the anniversary, when I picked up her phone by accident thinking it was mine, same case, same crack in the corner, and saw a notification preview from a contact saved simply as R.V. That said something about needing to talk before the board meeting. Nothing incriminating on its face, the kind of message that could belong to any working relationship. And I put the phone down and told myself that exact sentence could belong to any working relationship 3 or 4 times until I believed it. Here's a mini fact about marriages that fall apart quietly, the way mine did. It's never one lie. It's 100 small ones stacked so gently on top of each other that you don't feel the weight until you're already buried. About 6 weeks before our anniversary, I found a receipt in her coat pocket for a hotel bar downtown, $11, 1 drink, time-stamped at 9:40 on a Tuesday night. She'd told me she was stuck finishing an inspection report. I didn't confront her. I told myself it was probably a work thing, a client meeting that ran long, and I put the receipt back exactly where I found it, folded the same way, because some part of me already understood that once I said something out loud, I couldn't unsay it, and I wasn't ready. I want you to remember that feeling, that specific cowardice, because it's going to matter when you meet the man who stopped me on the sidewalk, because he'd been carrying a version of that same cowardice for 3 years, and it had cost him everything. Our anniversary fell on a Thursday. I'd booked us a table at Altero, the Italian place on 5th she'd been wanting to try for a year, the kind of restaurant where you have to request the reservation weeks out, and I'd planned the whole night around it, a bottle of the wine from our wedding, a gift I'd been saving, the whole sentimental production. At 6:50 my phone buzzed. "Stuck at work," she wrote. "So sorry, babe. Happy 10 years. 3 heart emojis, 1 kiss face, 20 words, covering a lie. I wouldn't understand the shape of, for another 2 hours. I told her it was fine. I told her we'd celebrate this weekend instead. I told her I loved her, and I meant it, and then I sat alone in our kitchen for 11 minutes doing absolutely nothing, just staring at the wall, because something in my chest had gone cold in a way I couldn't explain. Some animal part of me that had been quietly counting receipts and garage phone calls and disappearing text threads long before the rest of me caught up. I got in my car. I didn't decide to drive to Altero, not really. My hands just did it, the way your body sometimes knows something before your mind will admit it. I told myself I'd surprise her at her actual office, bring her flowers, make a joke out of it. I didn't let myself think past that. Voss Realty's office was dark. Not a single light on the 3rd floor where her desk sat by the window I used to wave up at when I picked her up from work in our first year of marriage. Stuck at work, from an office with the lights off. I sat in my car outside her building for 4 minutes doing math I didn't want to do, and then I drove 3 blocks to Altero, because some part of me already knew exactly where I'd find her, and I hated that part of me for knowing. Here's the moment I keep replaying, the exact one. Because it's the moment my whole life split in half. Through the restaurant's front window, past the hostess stand, at a corner table with a candle between them, I saw my wife lean forward in the same blue dress she wore on our first date 12 years ago. And I watched Richard Voss reach across the table, take her hand, and I watched her kiss him, not a peck, not an accident, a real kiss, the kind you give someone you've been building a whole separate life with. I don't remember crossing the parking lot. I remember my hand was already on the brass door handle, and I remember my whole body had gone hot and loud, the specific fury of 10 years compressed into about 4 seconds, and I remember thinking I was about to do something I couldn't undo. And honestly, in that moment, I didn't care. That's when the hand closed around my wrist. Not aggressive, not rough, just absolute. Like a man who'd done this exact thing before and knew precisely how much force it took to stop someone from making the worst decision of their life. I turned, ready to swing, and found myself looking at a man maybe 60 years old, gray wool coat, tired eyes that had clearly seen more than one bad night like this one. "Don't," he said. "Not here, not yet. You don't know what you're looking at, and if you walk through that door right now, you're going to destroy the only leverage either of us has." I asked him who the hell he was. He said his name was Frank Delacroix, and he said it like a man who'd said it to a lot of angry husbands before, and then he said something that stopped me colder than the kiss had. He said, "Your wife isn't the first woman Richard Voss has done this to, and she won't be the last, unless somebody finally has enough evidence to end him, and right now, you're the only person who can help me get it." I want to be honest, my first instinct was that this man was insane, or worse, some angle Richard had planted to talk me down before I made a scene that would embarrass him publicly, and I told Frank exactly that, and I told him to let go of my arm before I made him let go. He didn't flinch. He reached into his coat and pulled out a photograph, worn soft at the corners like it had lived in that pocket a long time. A woman in her 30s, tired eyes, standing outside a courthouse. "This is my daughter," he said. 3 years ago she worked accounting for Voss Realty. Same building, same office, same man reaching across a candlelit table. Except my daughter didn't have a choice, and neither does your wife. And if you walk in there and blow this up in a public tantrum, you're going to hand Richard Voss exactly what he needs to make sure nobody ever believes either of them. He also told me something that night I didn't fully understand the weight of until much later, that Marisol hadn't left Voss Realty on her own terms. She'd been quietly pushed out 11 months into the arrangement, the moment Richard sensed she was becoming unpredictable, unstable, a liability rather than an asset, and that the severance paperwork she'd signed on her way out included language broad enough to make any future accusation look like the bitter complaint of a disgruntled former employee, which was exactly the shape Richard tried to force onto every version of this story before it could become something else. Frank said watching his own daughter sign that paperwork, thanking a man for a severance package instead of reporting him to the police, was the single worst afternoon of his life, worse than his divorce, worse than the surgery that started the whole thing, because he understood in that moment that Richard hadn't just taken advantage of his daughter once, he'd built a legal shield specifically designed to survive her ever trying to speak up again. Everything in me wanted to call this a con. I wanted it to be a lie, because the alternative meant my wife hadn't simply betrayed me. She'd been trapped. And trapped by what? I didn't yet know, and not knowing was its own kind of unbearable. Frank asked me to walk with him, just to the corner, just far enough that we weren't visible from the restaurant window, and against every instinct I had, I went, because some part of me needed to hear the rest of it more than I needed to be right. He told me he'd been a private investigator for 22 years, most of it corporate fraud, embezzlement, the boring unglamorous cases nobody makes movies about, until 3 years ago, when his daughter, Marisol, had come to him white-faced and shaking, and told him she'd done something she couldn't undo. She'd been an accounts coordinator at Voss Realty, and during a brutal year when her mother, Frank's ex-wife, needed a surgery their insurance wouldn't fully cover, Marisol had quietly rerouted $18,000 from an escrow holding account into a personal transfer, planning to pay it back within a month once her mother's disability claim came through. It didn't come through in time. Richard found the discrepancy during a routine reconciliation, and instead of reporting it, instead of firing her, instead of doing anything a functioning human being would do, he sat her down in his office, closed the door, and told her he could make the whole thing disappear. Quietly. Off the books. No police, no charges, no ruined life. As long as she understood that she now owed him something. And that something turned into an arrangement that lasted 11 months before Marisol finally broke down and told her father everything. By then it was too late to go to the police without also incriminating her, and Richard knew it. And Richard had built an entire quiet system around that exact leverage. Because Marisol wasn't an accident, she was a pattern, a method. A man who specifically targeted employees who were drowning financially and desperate enough to make one bad decision he could later weaponize. I asked Frank why he was telling me this instead of his daughter finally taking Richard down 3 years ago, and his face did something complicated, something between grief and shame, and he said, because by the time she told me, the evidence was gone, deleted, and it was her word against a man with a company full of lawyers, and I've spent 3 years building a case the right way instead of the fast way, because the fast way already failed once, and I am not going to let it fail again with your wife. I asked him what he knew about Claire specifically, and this is where the ground under me really opened up, because Frank told me he'd been tracking financial irregularities at Voss Realty for over a year, a pattern of quiet transfers that always traced back to accounts Claire had signing authority over, and 11 months ago he'd found a transfer of $41,000, moved out of a client escrow account and back in within 6 weeks, timestamped to almost the exact week. My father's business had needed an emergency loan. He never got approved for through a bank. The loan I remember Claire telling me not to worry about. She said she'd found a private lender. A family friend. Don't ask too many questions. It's handled. It was handled. It was handled by my wife committing a crime to save my father's company and my father's dignity. And Richard Voss had found it. And instead of reporting her, he'd made the exact same offer he'd made to Marisol. Silence in exchange for something he never called blackmail out loud. Because he was smart enough to dress coercion up as a favor between friends. A favor that slowly, patiently, turned into exactly what I'd watched through that restaurant window. I felt something in me break in a completely different direction than I expected. I had walked toward that restaurant ready to be furious at my wife. I walked away from that corner furious at a man I'd shaken hands with exactly twice at a company holiday party. A man who apparently made a career out of finding good people at their most desperate, and turning their desperation into a leash. Frank told me the same thing he'd apparently failed to convince his own daughter of 3 years too late, that the only way to actually end this, permanently, for Claire and for however many women had come before her, was to gather real evidence, documented, time-stamped, corroborated, enough to expose Richard's coercion pattern without simultaneously destroying the women he'd trapped in it. He asked me to trust him for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of watching my wife lie to my face every single day, knowing what I now knew, and saying nothing, which might be the hardest thing I have ever done in my life, harder than the actual confrontation that came later, because love, it turns out, does not turn off just because you've learned the truth, it just gets more complicated, heavier, harder to carry without your hands shaking. I went home that night before Claire did. She came in around 10:30, apologizing again for missing our anniversary, and I hugged her, and I want you to understand what that hug actually was. It was me holding a woman I loved while knowing she was being extorted by a man who signed her paychecks. And it was me deciding, in that exact moment, that my anger belonged pointed at him, not at her. Even if I still had questions for her that would take months to fully ask. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I lay next to her listening to her breathing even out into something like actual rest for the first time in weeks, and I thought about calling my own father, waking him up at midnight just to hear his voice. Just to tell him what his daughter-in-law had risked to keep his company's lights on a little longer, and I didn't, because Frank had been clear that even a single misplaced conversation could unravel 11 months of careful evidence gathering. And because some part of me understood that this wasn't my story to tell yet, it was Claire's. And she deserved to be the one who eventually told my father herself, in her own words, whenever she was ready. Over the following 2 weeks, Frank and I built something like an uneasy partnership. He showed me bank transfer logs he'd obtained through channels he wouldn't fully explain, timestamps that lined up with 3 other women's employment records at Voss Realty going back 6 years, a pattern so consistent, it stopped looking like romance gone wrong, and started looking exactly like what it was, a system. I learned that Richard kept a second phone, that he used a shell consulting company to funnel what Frank believed were hush payments disguised as bonuses to keep the arrangement looking voluntary on paper, and I learned, on the 9th day, something that nearly broke the fragile trust I'd built with Frank entirely. Because he told me Claire had started asking questions of her own. She'd been quietly pulling her own transaction records. Apparently terrified, Richard was preparing to use the original $41,000 against her formally, to have her fired or worse the moment she stopped being useful to him. She wasn't covering her tracks anymore. She was building a case to protect herself, alone, with no idea her own husband and a stranger with a photograph in his coat pocket were building the exact same case 1 floor away from her. On the 4th day of that stretch, I nearly blew the whole thing apart without meaning to. Richard had apparently noticed Frank's daughter's old email address surface in a routine access log, a stray login from an account that should have been deactivated years earlier, and for 2 full days the entire investigation held its breath. Because if Richard connected that login to Marisol, and Marisol to Frank, and Frank to the sudden appearance of her husband hovering around company events he'd never once cared about before, the whole fragile structure would collapse before Patricia Ohm ever got the evidence packet in her hands. Frank called me at 11 at night, voice tighter than I'd heard it, and told me Richard had asked Claire directly, in his office, door closed, whether she'd heard from anyone unusual lately, anyone asking questions about old transfers, and Claire, God bless her, had said no without even understanding why the question mattered, because she still had no idea any of us existed. I sat across from her at dinner that night with my stomach in knots, watching her push pasta around her plate, quieter than usual, and when I asked if she was okay, she said Richard had been strange with her lately, paranoid, snapping at people over nothing, and she thought maybe the company's finances were in worse shape than anyone let on. I told her that sounded stressful. I did not tell her that the man across the desk from her had spent 3 years building a second life out of exactly this kind of paranoia, and that her husband already knew his name better than she did. On the 11th night, I almost told her everything. We were doing dishes, ordinary, quiet, the dog underfoot, and she looked so tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and I almost said Richard's name out loud just to watch her face confirm what I already knew. But Frank had asked me to wait exactly 1 more week, because Voss Realty's annual investor gala was coming up, the one night a year when the entire board, half the city's real estate community, and Richard Voss himself would all be in the same ballroom, and Frank believed it was the only setting where exposing him publicly wouldn't simply get buried the next morning by a company legal team. So, I waited. I hated waiting. I want to be honest that there were nights I lay awake next to Claire wondering if I was protecting her or just delaying my own explosion, and there's a version of this story where I don't wait, where I confront her at the sink with the dishwater running, where I blow the whole thing up 11 days early out of raw impatience, and Frank told me plainly that version ends with Richard's lawyers painting Claire as a willing participant in a messy affair, no coercion, no leverage, no evidence. Just a cheating wife and an angry husband, because that is exactly what happened to his daughter 3 years earlier when she tried to go it alone. The gala arrived on a Saturday in late autumn. The ballroom of the Wexford Hotel done up in gold and white, 200 guests, an open bar. Richard Voss, holding court near the stage in a tuxedo like a man who had never once in his life imagined consequences catching up to him. Claire attended as staff, expected to mingle, smile, make the company look good, completely unaware that her husband was standing near the back of the room with a private investigator who'd spent 3 years and 1 destroyed relationship with his own daughter, preparing for exactly this night. Frank had arranged for a board member, a woman named Patricia Ohm who sat on Voss Realty's audit committee and had quietly grown suspicious of financial irregularities of her own, to receive the full evidence packet an hour before the gala began. Time-stamped transfers, the shell company records, sworn corroboration from 2 former employees Frank had spent months convincing to finally go on record, women who'd left the company years ago and were still afraid to say Richard's name above a whisper. Patricia stood up during what was supposed to be a routine toast to the company's 10th consecutive year of growth, and instead of raising her glass, she said she had an urgent matter to bring before the board, and the room, effective immediately, regarding financial misconduct and abuse of authority by the company's founder. I watched Richard's face do something I will remember for the rest of my life, the exact half-second where a man realizes the floor he's been standing on for years was never actually solid. He tried to laugh it off first, the way men like him always do, said something about disgruntled former employees and misunderstood bonus structures. And for a moment I watched half the room actually start to believe him, because a man in a well-tailored tuxedo standing under gold chandeliers carries a kind of built-in credibility that a quiet accusation has to fight uphill against. Patricia laid it out clean and factual. No accusations of romance. No messy personal details. Exactly the way Frank had coached her. Financial coercion used to silence employees who had made errors under personal duress. A documented pattern spanning 6 years and at least 4 women. And she named the shell company, and she named the escrow discrepancies, and she made it unmistakably clear this was a story about an employer, weaponizing his employees' worst moments against them. Not a story about women who'd simply made bad choices. Then she opened a second folder and read 2 sentences aloud from a sworn statement given by a former employee named Renata Cole, who had left Voss Realty 4 years earlier, and had spent those 4 years too frightened to say Richard's name above a whisper, and the room went so quiet I could hear ice shifting in a glass 3 tables away. Richard's laugh didn't come back after that. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him, like a man doing math that refused to add up, glancing toward the exit, toward his lawyer, toward anyone who might tell him this wasn't actually happening in front of 200 of the city's most influential real estate professionals. I found Claire in the chaos afterward, in a service hallway off the ballroom where she'd fled, mascara down her face, hands shaking so hard she couldn't hold her own phone, and she looked at me with an expression that had absolutely no idea how much I already knew, and she said, "I have to tell you something. And I have been so scared to tell you for so long." And before she could get another word out, I told her I already knew, all of it, the $41,000, my father's business, Richard's arrangement, Frank, the 2 weeks I'd spent knowing and saying nothing because I was terrified saying something too soon would destroy the only chance either of us had. She didn't get angry that I'd known and hidden it. She cried in a completely different way than I expected, relief instead of shame. Because for 11 months, she had been carrying something entirely alone, certain that if I ever found out, I would only see the affair and never see the 18 months of quiet extortion underneath it, and instead I was standing in front of her already having chosen, before she even had to ask, to be angry at the man who'd built a trap around her instead of at the woman who'd fallen into it trying to save my own father. I remember standing in that service hallway holding her while a hotel security guard tried to figure out whether he was supposed to be doing something about the commotion in the ballroom, and I remember Claire asking me, voice raw, whether I could ever actually look at her the same way again, and I told her the truth, that I didn't think I'd look at her the same way. I thought I'd look at her with a kind of respect I hadn't fully understood I owed her before that night. Because everything she'd done, every terrible decision in that whole tangled mess, had started with trying to keep my family from losing something my father had spent 30 years building, and I could not, in good conscience, call that a betrayal of me. Even with everything else layered on top of it, the fallout took months to fully settle. Richard Voss was removed from the company within a week, and criminal charges for coercion and financial misconduct followed within 2, based largely on the corroborated statements Frank had spent 3 years collecting one frightened, hesitant conversation at a time. It turned out Renata Cole was only the beginning. In the 2 weeks following the gala, 3 more former employees came forward on their own, having watched the story break in the local business press, women who'd spent years assuming they were the only ones foolish enough to fall into Richard's arrangement. And there is a particular kind of grief in learning your specific private shame was actually a documented pattern, a system with a track record. But there is also, underneath that grief, something close to relief. The relief of finally understanding it was never really about anything you did wrong. It was about a man who had simply gotten very good at finding people standing close enough to a cliff edge, and giving them one gentle, deliberate push. Claire's original escrow transfer came under review, but between Patricia's testimony about the coercive context, and Claire voluntarily repaying the full amount the moment she was able to speak freely about it, the board chose not to pursue charges against her, treating her instead as exactly what she was, a victim of an abuse of power who'd made one desperate decision under pressure nobody should have had to carry alone. Frank told me, the last time I saw him, standing outside the courthouse where Richard's case was formally filed, that this was the first time in 3 years he'd managed to end one of these the right way, instead of watching another woman get quietly destroyed for trusting the wrong man, and he thanked me, which felt backward, because he was the one who'd stopped me on a sidewalk from doing something that would have handed Richard exactly the outcome he wanted. A few weeks after that, Claire asked if we could meet Marisol, the woman whose photograph had started all of this, and I watched 2 strangers who'd survived nearly identical versions of the same nightmare sit across a coffee shop table from each other and talk for almost 3 hours. Not about Richard mostly, but about the specific loneliness of carrying a secret you're certain will end your marriage the moment it's spoken, and about how strange it felt to finally put that weight down in front of someone who understood it without needing it explained. Marisol told Claire something that day that Claire later repeated to me more than once. that the version of this story where you stay silent forever isn't actually safer. It just moves the damage further down the road and hands it to a version of yourself with even less strength left to carry it. And I think some part of Claire had needed to hear that from someone who'd lived it rather than from a husband who, however much he loved her, hadn't. Claire and I spent the next several months in the kind of honest, difficult conversations we should have been having years earlier, about money, about my father's illness, about the specific loneliness of carrying a family's financial survival on your shoulders while your husband has no idea how close to the edge you're standing, and we made a decision together that we've kept since. No more solo sacrifices, no more silent handling. Whatever comes at us from now on, it comes at both of us at the same time. We started something small at first, just a shared spreadsheet neither of us had ever bothered keeping before. Every account, every debt, every number laid out where both of us could see it. Not because we suddenly became financial experts overnight, but because the entire disaster with Richard had only been possible in the dark, in the space where one person carries a number the other person never sees, and we promised each other, more than once, in more than one late-night conversation at that same kitchen table, that we were done building that particular kind of dark space between us, whatever the actual cost of honesty turned out to be. My father's company still didn't survive. In the end, illness and debt rarely wait for anyone's timeline, but he passed knowing his daughter-in-law had tried to save it with everything she had, including pieces of herself she didn't get back easily. On our 11th anniversary, a year almost to the day after a stranger's hand closed around my wrist outside a restaurant window, Claire and I went back to Altero, the same table if they could manage it. And this time there was no text at 6:50 telling me she was stuck at work, no hearts, no lie dressed up as an apology, just her, sitting across from me in the same blue dress, telling me the truth about everything, out loud, in her own voice. No one else's leverage standing between us anymore. And I realized the anniversary I actually wanted to remember wasn't the one where everything looked perfect from a window outside. It was this one, ordinary and honest and completely, finally, ours.